Okay, well, welcome and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are happy you have taken time out of your busy morning to be a part of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Chicago Metropolitan Chapter series on the ABCs of Money, hosted by the Sisternomics Committee, where the topic today will be on closing the racial wealth gap. And I am a member of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Chicago Metropolitan Chapter. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator who will be facilitating this amazing panel discussion on closing the racial wealth gap, Dora Gardner, who is also a member of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Chicago Metropolitan Chapter.
I'm the head of the Chicago Community Trust. Chicago Community Trust is the community foundation for the Chicago region. We've been around for 105 years and really focused on the issues that are the biggest challenge for our region. My background is I'm a pediatrician and a public health physician, spending a couple of decades with the Centers for Disease Control, as well as working for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then I headed a international nonprofit focused on global poverty care, the organization that brought you the care package. So anyway, my career has been between health and economic development.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Gayle. Next, we'll move to Mr. Shundrawn Thomas, who is the president of Northern Trust Asset Management. Mr. Thomas.
Yes, good morning, and I want to thank you for being able to participate with this illustrious panel. Shundrawn Thomas, I serve professionally as the president and chief executive of Northern Trust Asset Management. We're about a 1.2 trillion global asset manager, and as part of the overall Northern Trust Corporation, where I serve on the executive management committee there. Personally, I'm the father of two great sons, one in college and one on his way in a year, and one amazing wife. And I'm a product of the South Side of Chicago, and just glad to be here this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Next, we'll have Dr. Rhonda Henderson, who's the CEO of Lucbene Consulting. Dr. Henderson.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be in this space with you. So I am Dr. Rhonda Henderson, owner of Lucbene Realty, which specializes in small business development and entrepreneurship. I am also the managing broker of Lucbene Realty, which specializes in the residential market. And using both companies, I teach individuals essentially how to run a real estate investment company. I'm also a full-time business professor for City Colleges of Chicago. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhonda. Last but certainly not least, we'll move to Dr. Andre Weathersby Rawls, who is the founder of Visions Investment Network Consortium. Dr. Rawls.
Good morning. Thank you, Dora, and thank you to the National Coalition of 100 Black Women for providing this opportunity to have such an important conversation about the acquisition of wealth. I am Andre Rawls. I hold a Juris Doctorate, which is a doctorate in clinical psychology, and a Juris Doctorate, which is a law degree, and a doctorate in clinical psychology, a PsyD. I'm founder of Visions Investment Network Consortium. There are currently 7 clubs that are operating in the network. The first club was started in 1993, and it's been in business for over 28 years. Over the course of the years, we've had 15 clubs come in, and some have stopped doing business. It is an opportunity for women to learn investments on the ground floor with their friends and in a safe environment. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you to each of you for taking a few moments to tell us a little bit about who you are, and again, the amazing work that you're currently doing. I wanted our audience to hear a little bit about that because I'm personally in awe of the amazing breadth and scope of your careers and what you've done in the world of finance, as well as investing and empowerment. With that said, today we've gathered for a topic that is as timely today as it has ever been in our nation's history. and that is the racial wealth gap. Over the course of the last year, throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, certain disparities that, quite frankly, have always existed, particularly in Black and Brown communities, have been illustrated and brought to the forefront, in some ways, dire situations. One of those disparities that has impacted many of us is the racial wealth gap. With that said, the first question I'd like to pose, I'd like for the entire panel to answer individually. And that question is this: what is the racial wealth gap? What are the contributing factors that have led to that wealth gap? And lastly, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the racial wealth gap?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you, Dr. Gayle.
So, and this is a topic that is incredibly important for us as an organization at the Chicago Community Trust, because we've made closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap our highest organizational priority. And we did that because we recognize that if you want to tackle any of the key issues that we face here in Chicago, and I would say around the nation, it is that inequality in wealth that kind of undergirds so many things. And so, I started out as a physician and focused a lot of my time on health disparities. And the longer you focus on that, the more you realize that if you just focus on health and access to health, you might make some difference. But if you're really focusing on what we call the social determinants of health, that's where you have the greatest impact. And so, it was increasingly clear to me that if I wanted to have anything to do with health or other issues, tackling this racial and ethnic wealth gap was so core to it. And we can throw out a lot of statistics. We know that if you look at Black and white and Latinx community here, there's a kind of a tenfold at least wealth. We know that whites in America own about 80% of the wealth in this country. And if you look at African American Latinx, it's less than 5%. Here in Chicago, 70% of Black and Latinx families live in what we call liquid asset poverty. They can't make it without a paycheck for 3 months before being plunged into poverty, where that's about 30%, just less than 30% for whites. So, you can look at statistic after statistic, but it's very clear that this sustained wealth gap is real. It's impacting disproportionately people of color, and it has long roots that I'm sure we'll talk about that kind of led to where we are, and the COVID crisis has just amplified it.
Thank you, Dr. Helene. Dr. Andre, I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas. I'm sorry, Shundrawn.
No, I figured I would just offer this, just building on, because I think that Dr. Gill made some really important points, but if I could edify a couple, because when I think about the wealth gap, again, and we're specifically talking about the disparity in median wealth between different races. But what I like to say when I talk about this, because the numbers can skirt by you, it's not a wealth gap, it's a wealth gulf. So if we look at, the most recent Federal Reserve data we have, and we're talking about the median or typical white family with roughly 188,000 worth of wealth or net worth. And when you compare that to 36,000 for Hispanics and 24,000 for Blacks. So we're effectively saying that a Hispanic family has on average 20 cents on the dollar relative to a white family, and a Black family 13 cents on the dollar. So the first thing, the scope of it is significant, and we have to just really appreciate that. The other thing is the part to drive home is it's not just at the lowest levels. We think of the wealth gap as a disparity among sort of the have-nots. But when you look at wealthy African Americans, one of the things that you see is we're not accomplishing or achieving wealth among the affluent at the same nature or level as our white counterparts. And so this is interesting. If you're a white American with a high school diploma, you're head of the household, you have about the same probability of becoming a millionaire as a Black head of household with a master's degree. All right. So again, the scope of this is significant. To your question, just quickly on what I would say, what the nature of it is, it's not happenstance, it's not misfortune, it's not bad behaviors. The inconvenient truth that we have to accept, it is a direct result of systemic inequities, most notably systemic racism, right? And the cost, again, Dr. Gayle referred to it, is both in health and wealth disparities, and they really do go together. And it means that the empowered, both in the public and private sectors, it's a direct result of either actions that they have taken and continue to take, or actions that they choose not to take, right? That is the predominant driver of it. And so the reason I point that out is just to end. So then the address has to be threefold. Is there a personal responsibility that we all have? Of course, right? That's one of the three legs. But if you say, what is the principal driver of it? It has to be a public address. So think government. It has to be a private address. Think companies, for-profit and nonprofit. And then there's a personal aspect to it.
Shundrawn, I really thank you so much for that response and how multifaceted it was, because I think often when we engage in conversations about wealth and income disparities and how that impacts communities of color, so often we're taught that we should just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And this is the land of opportunity and that there's enough for everyone. But to your point, there have been underlying systems, infrastructures that have been built that are systemically racist in their nature, that have contributed significantly to that, as you said so well, not a gap, but a gulf that exists in this country to the very day, right? And we have actions that many are not taking and many that they have taken, which have funneled in and fed that system of systemic racism. So thank you so much for that response. I'll move now to Dr. Rhonda. Dr. Rhonda, what are your thoughts on that question? What is the wealth gap? What are some of the contributing factors that have led to it? And how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted it?
I absolutely agree what Mr. Thomas and Dr. Gayle has stated. And so just adding to that, gaining an understanding of those factors is very important. And so if we do look at systemic racism and just overall those different factors that have led to the Black and Brown community essentially being not able to build wealth in this country, it becomes something that we essentially need to focus on. When I think of those factors, of course, when you start thinking about different opportunities that were not necessarily given to that particular group, or those hurdles that have been put in place, all of that comes into play. But this particular question really is resonating with me. When we start thinking about COVID and everything that has gone on, and just recognizing the different households that are suffering because of COVID and not being able to continue to strive. And it really makes it more recognizable, everything that's going on. And so the points that they made were absolutely on target. And so I just want to just add that we just need to look a little bit further at those factors that's causing the problem.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I appreciate your response. Next, we'll end this particular question with Dr. Andre Rawls. Dr. Rawls, your thoughts on the pandemic, the impacts of the pandemic to the racial wealth gap, and what is the wealth gap, and the contributing factors that have led to us having this wealth gap. And like Mr. Thomas mentioned, really a wealth gulf, because the divide is huge. Dr. Andre, your thoughts?
Thank you. I think both Mr. Thomas and Dr. Gayle both gave us some very good historical information and good information about where we stand as a people. from the work that I do, we work more with individuals and that basic conversation about what is income, what is wealth, what is the difference. We come to this country with a history of slavery, and that is our legacy. We don't come with British coins or gold in our pockets. We came working from the bottom up. So what we try to do with the women that we work with is give them a new language around money, a new thought around money. And so COVID-19 has been increasingly difficult because day-to-day survival has been threatened for everyone. And so people are out of or don't want to think about wealth accumulation. They want to think about survival today. So it makes that big of a difference. We still have to keep one of the things our brokers tell us all the time is, while the stock market may be going down temporarily, overall, it continues to go up. And unless you're in that stream of going up, then you can't appreciate the wealth that's being acquired by this country. So I just want to, I know I'm not the high level financier, but from the ground level, there's a lot that we can learn just to understand the language of money, the language of wealth.
So actually, Dr. Andre, I would disagree with you. I think you said something that's really profound when you talked about changing the language around money and wealth, because if it's difficult to communicate and engage with a thing, then it's going to be less likely that you'll be able to apprehend it and master it, take control of it. And so I think that's so profound, because in many situations, whether it's having a lower credit score or having a few assets, or the way we just simply interact with money as consumers, as producers, that language, that trajectory around our language has to change in order for our thought processes to change and us to move in a direction where we can appreciate it for the tool that it is and use it such as. So thank you. That actually was an awesome response. I appreciate that. Now, we received some questions in advance of today's discussion. Our next question, and Dr. Andre, you actually led us right into this question. This is actually going to be for Dr. Helene Gayle. And Dr. Gayle, sometime a little more than a year ago, in a video posted to Chicago Ideas, you talked about the concept of wealth and income, and more specifically, how they impact one's outcomes. Dr. Gayle, I'd like you to take a few moments to talk about or explain the difference between wealth and income and why that difference matters. Dr. Gayle?
Yeah, so it's huge. And, so often we talk about income disparity, and we know that there is income disparity here in this country as well. And we know that sometimes people get paid more based on their race, their gender, et cetera. But, income is a slice in time. You take a paycheck, and so many of us live paycheck to paycheck. So we get a paycheck, we spend the paycheck, and we have nothing left. Wealth is about assets and accumulating assets. It's how you turn that income into something that allows you to invest in a home, invest in a building, have savings so that your children can go off to school, or as was mentioned, investing in the stock market so you can see your return. So wealth is really the accumulation of your assets that have value. And I think it's so important for people to remember. I remember, when I first realized that if I got a flat tire in my car, I actually had the money saved that I could get a new tire. And it was like, eureka, I have assets. And so I just think that that notion between income and what you bring in on a weekly, monthly basis, what have you, which can go straight out the door, and accumulating assets is important. And I think, in different ways, each of the speakers have touched on some of that is about personal responsibility, but some of that is also about the policies. Are we allowed to accumulate assets? We know that, middle class was created in this country by the ability to buy homes. We were left out of that through redlining. We were not given loans to buy homes, or if we were given loans, we were given loans to buy home in certain areas that had high risk, that wouldn't appreciate. And here in Chicago, we had this horrific history of contract buying, which was kind of the worst of both situations. You were like a renter, but with nobody to take care of your maintenance. You weren't really a buyer because you weren't accumulating. And so, there was a study that suggested that somewhere in the range of $4 billion of wealth was extracted from Black communities because of this system of redlining and contract buying. So I could go on and on. I know others will have more to say about it, but this notion of remembering the difference between wealth and income. Income is great. Get the best salary you can, get the best compensation you can, but then make sure you're turning that into assets, which are, what will tide you over and what allows you to pass things on to the next generation. And I just go back to the comments that were made earlier around, Black men with master's degrees versus those with high school. And a lot of that is about the fact that they are inheriting wealth, which allows them to then sink that into businesses, which allows them to create wealth. And we have to think about all the ways in which we should be thinking about wealth creation.
Dr. Gayle, I'm so glad you touched on redlining and contract buying, specifically in the Chicagoland area. And you touched upon a few other things as well that actually encompass some of the questions that we received in advance. Because so often we look at different neighborhoods or different peoples in those neighborhoods, and we say, well, we've got our home here in Frankfurt or in Wilmette. And then, you're here on 63rd in Inglewood. Why can't you do the same things that we do? And so it's so easy to get caught in the mire of, again, as I mentioned earlier, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, that you think that there's equality and equity there, but there's not. Your home is valued at disproportionate amounts greater than that home, right? The access to wealth, to your point, is significantly depreciated because of areas and redlining and all of these policies that have been implemented that devalue a Black household in comparison to a household perhaps in another neighborhood, and how that impacts, to your point, our ability to accumulate assets and ergo wealth and move beyond just having income, which is fine, but it doesn't sustain. And to your point in the video, it actually impacts our outcomes. I like the example you gave of the flat tire. I remember being an undergrad going through that a couple of times where I had a flat tire and I had to borrow money because I didn't have money to fix the tire. And I remembered when I got to a point where if I had a breakdown to my car or any breakdown, I could just go and get it fixed. And that was when I realized, so that resonated with me. Wait a minute, I think maybe I'm doing the right things or better things now with my finances. So thank you for that. I appreciate that response. Our next question is going to be for Dr. Andre. Dr. Andre, so often you'll talk to people who have difficulties with investing. Let's say you've never invested before, whether you're 25 or 55. What advice would you give someone who's new to investing, who's quite honestly afraid to invest? They think that they need to have a PhD or a lot of education in order to understand the stock market and the concept of investing. So again, whether you're 25 or 55, what advice would you give someone, Dr. Andre, who's new to investing?
So I think the first thing I would say to them is start somewhere. One of the things we like about the clubs is that you can start safely. If you're in a club, you're not investing anybody's grocery money. You're sort of investing the money that we start with clubs that have as little as $25 a month investing. And for $25 a month, you can find ways to waste money very easily. So we try to show them that rather than take this money and do wasteful things, this money can begin to work for you. And when I say start, there are a lot of opportunities out here. There is a whole online investment one-on-one free course that anybody can just call up and take. So look for opportunities to learn about investing, either by yourself or with a group. And one of the things we do is when we started, we knew nothing. We had our Beardstown Lady book, and that was our Bible, and that's how we got started. And over the course of years, we've become a lot more savvy. We know things like balancing portfolios, which was absolute Greek to us at the beginning. We know industries, we know sectors. We didn't know anything about that. So what my goal, and many of the ladies, let me say this, that started with us were way over 50. We're way over 50. So don't ever think it's too late to begin to acquire wealth. One of the things that Dr. Gayle mentioned, and when she was talking, I wanted to go, right, make your money work for you. You should not be working for your money only. Your money needs to work for you. So I think that's kind of some of the things we can look at in terms of beginning the process. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Dr. Andre, for that
I
insightful
would
response.
like to add to that.
Yes, Dr. Rhonda,
That's
please do.
okay.
Yes.
Yes, so I absolutely agree with Dr. Andre. It's not too late to get started. But one of the things that should be the first focus is gaining an understanding of money managing and budgeting. And so you don't want to become so caught up in investing where it affects your day-to-day living because you haven't set up an emergency fund or you haven't started budgeting for uncertainties like the tire being flat or need to be repaired first, and then putting your money into the investment pool. And so ultimately, this money management and understanding assets is very important because the problem people have is that they don't understand the value of certain assets. And so first, gaining that knowledge in regards to understanding just the financial cycle, money coming in and out, how it circulates through the community, where to place it best, will be a great start. Then jumping into the investment, looking into the various groups as Dr. Andre discussed. So I just wanted to add that.
That's excellent, Dr. Rhonda. I appreciate you jumping in to add that. I think that's really important. Understanding how to manage money and assets, first and foremost, because that impacts your day-to-day, which will eventually impact, of course, your ability to invest intelligently and thoughtfully. So thank you for that. For those that are just joining us today, again, on behalf of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Chicago Metropolitan Chapter, thank you for joining us for today's discussion on the ABCs of money, closing the racial wealth gap. Again, thank you for joining. We are excited and happy that you're here. Our next question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add something, and I totally agree with all the comments focused on what we can do as individuals. But I also want us to remember that this is in the context of a system that is designed to hold us back. And I think Shundrawn, you said it best, that it's kind of a three-legged stool. We have to think about what we can do as individuals, what companies can do, and what policies are important. Because I think I only say it because I think too often, we place it on the individual, and that is necessary but not sufficient. And there's not enough financial literacy in the world that is going to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. It's the right thing to do. I just, I come away from some of these conversations so often where people feel like, okay, all I need to do is to figure out, how I get enough money in the bank, and that's fine for individuals. But I think when we think about this issue, and we look, and we don't want to be 100 years from now with Black people still in the situation where we have nothing. It's broader than what the individual can do. And I say that with total due respect to all of the important work that goes on to make sure that individuals are using their money in the right way, understanding investment and all the rest of it. But we're not going to close the racial wealth gap unless we think about all of these different levers.
Well, then, if that's the case, it goes a little bit deeper because as we know historically, a lot of minorities don't trust the system. And so because of that lack of trust, they're not opening themselves up to different opportunities that can change the wealth gap. And even though there are these hurdles in front of us, just even when you think about the shot, with COVID, there's so many people that's like, I'm not getting the shot because I don't trust what it is, and the Tuskegee experiment, et cetera, et cetera. But this here just amplifies the lack of trust for the system. And so how can we really change and talk about these institutions when it does start with overall our community and the trust factors that we have?
So from a policy perspective and a system perspective, understanding, of course, that racism is systemic and that it is meant to oppress, in some cases racialize, criminalize, demonize Black and brown bodies. From a policy perspective, what are your thoughts on how we would go about impacting change in such a way that it changes some of that infrastructure that, again, has existed for more than 424 years, that has been created, to your point, Dr. Gayle, to prevent Black and brown bodies from obtaining wealth in this country? What are the policies that are underway, to your knowledge, right now that would help bridge that divide a little bit? Because the gulf, to Mr. Thomas's point, is going to exist. It is real. It is valid. What are some of those larger policies that we could work to actually impact, to help move that forward? And what are some of the things from a corporation and institutional perspective that can be done to help bridge that gap or that gulf a little bit? I'd love to get your thoughts on that, Dr. Gayle.
Yeah,
as well as you, Mr. Thomas.
So if we keep doing what we're doing at the pace that we're doing it at, we'll be another 200 years still working on this. And if you think about the many barriers that were put in place, intentionally put in place, we know the history. We were, slavery ended, there was Reconstruction. Reconstruction would have given a lot of opportunities. That Reconstruction was canceled, and we've gone through this process of trying to figure out how do you get ahead when you start so far behind and when you have intentional obstacles put in your place. And I think that from a public policy standpoint, you've got to really think about what are the policies that could make a difference and make right and make whole a people who a lot has been taken away from. Some people will talk about reparations. We know in Evanston, there is a kind of a pilot program looking at the issue of reparations. Everybody doesn't like that term, but I think something that thinks about how do you actually go about redressing some of the wrongs, thinking about ways in which people have been economically harmed, and put in policy places that at least seek to make changes around it. So as an example, earned income tax credit. People like the earned income tax credit because it really is helping provide stability to families. There's a lot more that could be done to expand earned income tax credit. There's a lot of discussion about things like child savings accounts and baby bonds, things where children actually get money deposited into an account. It can be actually done so that children who are poor get more over time, and that by the time they're done with high school, they actually have kind of mimicking what intergenerational wealth would be. They have a savings account that will allow them to go to school, do other things, and not go further in debt. And so I think that, I'm just giving those as examples. I think that there are ways that public policy can really look at, not just helping people where they are, but recognizing that if you start at a deficit, you really have to think about how do you help to get people up. That's what equity is about. It's not giving everybody the same thing. It's giving people what they need so that they are able to get ahead. And I do think that there's a lot of interesting things going on now. We know that policies like the CRA Act was done in response to redlining so that there would be more flexible lending and lending to banks that are more likely to provide resources in communities. Here in Illinois, we just had the bill passed that put a cap on predatory lending. You know, poor people have more interest when they try to take out a loan than those of us who have means. So predatory lenders could charge up to 400% interest for a loan. You know, now that's capped. We'll see where that goes. But I think there are all of these sort of things that are in the public policy domain that we need to think about if we really want to make sure that we're redressing some of the harms and some of the situations that put people of color at a systematic disadvantage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gayle. I really appreciate that response. Thank you. We're going to move next to a question that we received for Dr. Rhonda, actually. I'd like to get your thoughts on this topic. As it relates to creating financial literacy, what's a good time to provide financial literacy for children? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, it's never too early. So as soon as your child is in a position where they're asking for stuff and they understand that it takes money to buy certain things that they desire, becomes the time that parents should start teaching their children about financial literacy. And also just having that transparency in the household, sharing with your children those things that it takes for the household to run, the amount of money that it's needed to keep the lights on, why mommy and daddy go to work, et cetera, et cetera. And so ultimately, the earlier this information is embedded in the child, the more important they will see that it is to sustaining their future.
That is actually an excellent response, and it gives me some validation as a parent because I remember when my son was small, my husband and I tried to take the mistakes that we made when we were in undergrad, and we know lots of those mistakes where they send you a plethora of credit cards, and you do not have the means to pay back those credit cards, but it seems like a good idea at the time. And I remember, going through a few mistakes in those days and learning from those mistakes. And of course, getting a lot better with managing money and assets. To that extent, when our son was small, we taught him all the time about, to your point, what it costs to pay the mortgage, to have on the lights, to pay the gas, to pay the car, all of those things, to help him appreciate the value of money and saving and his responsibility as it related to that. So thank you for that. Thank you for that response. I really appreciate that. I think I'm going to direct our next question to Mr. Thomas. So Mr. Thomas, we know that generally speaking, wealth is passed down from generation to generation. So from your experience, what are the kinds of assets that tend to bolster wealth for the average American household?
Right. So first, if I might do this, I think offer some perspective, because if you think about like total amount of dollars, there's significant wealth that passes from generation to generation. But if you think about the typical circumstance, it's not what people think. So if we were to take a statistic and say millionaires, roughly about 80% of billionaires did not receive any inheritance, like not a single dollar. Also, I work in a firm where it's an investment and we're known for wealth management, over 131 years. The typical cycle with wealth is this: one generation makes it, the next generation gets it and spends it and wastes it, and the third generation starts again. Now, there are exceptions. We know the names. We could probably kick off about 4 or 5, but I want to make sure people are aware there's a bit of an availability bias with respect to that. Now, it doesn't mean that passing down wealth is not important, but where I really want to encourage people, it's whatever you can do with respect to wealth, but it's also the importance of wealthy habits. And in some respects, the wealthy habits are more valuable than the wealth. Now, the kinds of things that I would say to your specific question is, number one, we alluded to this, but if I go back to some of the comments that were made around real estate, I hear if I had a dime for every time I heard that we need to build wealth through home ownership, I would be more wealthy than I am, right? What I would say is this: I'm pro home ownership, but I need people to appreciate that the practical reality for Black families, given where we tend to live, is we are not going to amass significant wealth through home ownership. I know people don't like that answer, but it's empirically true. It doesn't mean you shouldn't own a home. I can tell you all the other good reasons to own a home, but I'm saying that your basic expectation, and there are ways if you really wanted to be wealthy. And why is that important? Even if you look at sort of affluent or wealthy African Americans, we tend to have a higher percentage of our assets in our home equity. And it's not growing at the same as other financial assets. The other thing is this: if we're seeking to build wealth over time, you have to be exposed to financial assets. I loved what Dr. Andre said in terms of start wherever you are. I mean, even if it's $25, right? Because what you find is that people of color in general, specifically Blacks though, we are likely to hold, not only less likely to hold financial assets like stocks, bonds, or mutual funds, even when we have the means to. And when we do have financial assets, we tend to get the least risky. So we have lots of insurance and lots of money market funds and CDs and savings bonds. So the easiest way I could say that is in investing, you get paid to take risk. And as an investor, that's what I'm paid to do. And so it's a term we would use. You have a poor risk-adjusted return on your portfolio. So you're not even benefiting from the risks that you're taking. And so we've actually got to own the right things even when we invest. The last thing I would say is, and I really liked Dr. Henderson's comments earlier, personal finance comes into play because in addition to investing, you've got to have your financial situation right, particularly how we deal with debt. And so we tend to be overextended in debt. And again, I know people have heard the so-called good debt. The good debt equation doesn't work as well for us. Again, remember what I said about home equity and how it will appreciate. So you should be very conservative about how much mortgage debt you take on. We tend to have more turnover and more risk at our jobs. So you should go to a school that you can afford. I love the program that they have in the city colleges where they'll pay for kids to go to school. Some people are doing that for their first couple of years, then transferring to university. These are healthy wealth habits that we don't talk about in our community.
Mr. Thomas, you just said a book full. Those are such incredible key points and such high level advice, words of advice. Thank you for that. Literally, he just said a book full. And it's spot on. Thank you for that. Much appreciated. And along those lines, and I'd like to ask everyone, because we've gotten a few questions via the Q&A. Is there a link, like a Investing 101, a link or a good resource that people could leverage to learn more about investing as a course or a book? So just think of it as, Investing 101. What are some of the resources that a person could go to find that type of information? Anyone on the panel, any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm happy to start quickly. I mean, being an author for books, and I read all the time, I'm shocked at how much people don't read. Everything you want to know, you can find in a book, right? True. But let me be specific to your question. Literally, when I came out of school, almost 3 decades ago, I was interested in looking at how I could focus on my personal finance, even though I was a business major. And so, the first thing I got, and it gets updated regularly, is the what they call the series for dummies. So Eric Tyson has Personal Finance for Dummies, Investing for Dummies, and Estate Planning for Dummies. I mean, I literally still have those books. I share them with people all the time. Don't let the title put you off. It's a great fundamental resource when you're thinking about those aspects of it. I think there are other books that help you, sort of go beyond that. There's an African-American author, Chris Hogan, if people have heard of him. He has a book, Everyday Millionaires. You think of David Ramsey's Total Money Makeover. A classic like The Millionaire Next Door, to think about money habits. And the last thing I would say is I really do believe there's a public policy part of the equation where we can influence. And so you should think about books like, if you've heard of Rodney Patterson, Trumping the Race Card. He's a Black author. And for those who have read it, one more book, The Color of Law, if you want to really appreciate systemically the challenges that we deal with and what we have to come across. So out in there, but books, it's in a book. Expand that library, you'll be on your way.
And I would say, yeah, I would say I love The Color of Law, and I think it made the point. And I would agree with what you said. Home ownership is not necessarily the way we create wealth for many African Americans, but it was the way we were robbed of wealth because of the inability back when that would have been, and the ability to move into neighborhoods that would have created more returns. I would just add to that, I've just discovered podcasts, and you can learn about.
You just discovered podcasts, Dr. Gayle?
Well, I knew they were around, but I was trying to carve out how to use them. So now, when I had time to do, so, I've now organized my whole workout routine around when I can listen to podcasts. And I would just say, everybody doesn't have time to, we should all make time to read books. But I will say podcasts in 20 minutes, while you're on the treadmill, while you're walking your dog, there's so much information out there now for all of us. And I just think, we should just all be much more informed about the world of money and economics, because it is hugely important for us.
Yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
And like Dr. Gayle, I love podcasts as well. Audiobooks, there's a lot of great audiobooks out there. And I'm becoming a fan of Clubhouse. You can get on Clubhouse, and there's a lot of great conversation going on there in regards to investing and wealth building. So there's definitely a lot of information. It's just about being open to finding it.
Thank you. Dr. Andre, your thoughts?
Actually, I don't have much to add. They actually covered the waterfront. I will say that if you do a investing 101 search in any browser, you will come up with some investing 101 information. I think it's not as easy to access because you have to read it and look for it. I would say the podcast number one, and some of the suggestions that were made by the other presenters were absolutely spot on. So I don't need to take away anything from that.
So I know we're at just about the top of the hour, and we have about 4 more minutes left. I wanted to ask you all if you wouldn't mind if we extended the conversation just about 5 more minutes to take on another question, if that's okay.
I may need to skirt out, but I'll stay as long as I can.
Thank you, Dr. Gayle. Oh, Mr. Thomas, would you mind typing in the chat when you have an opportunity some of the resources, the books that you so graciously mentioned when you were speaking? So an additional question that we received is this, and Dr. Gayle, I think you actually talked about it a little bit earlier. What are some of the strategies to help the disenfranchised understand this information? And Dr. Andre, I know this is also part of your work, and as well as you, Dr. Rhonda, but what are some strategies that can be used to help, again, disenfranchised people understand this information? How do we go about providing that education?
Yeah, and I continue to think about this 2 or 3-legged stool, because, a lot of what we've talked about is what can individuals do. But individuals live in the context of a system. And, we know here in Chicago, there was a study that was done recently that showed that the investment in one neighborhood in North Chicago was more than all the investment made in all of Black Chicago neighborhoods. And so, I still kind of go back to, there's lots of ways of thinking about this wealth gap. Some of it is, can those of us who have education, have access, do better to, kind of pull the top up, if you will. But there's going to be a lot of people left behind at the bottom. And I think that that's where it's a mixture of how do we make sure that people who may not have many resources understand how on an individual level they can start thinking smarter about their own personal finances. So I think that's a huge part of it. But I also think that unless we start thinking about what are some of the systemic barriers that impact Black people as a whole, you know, we'll continue to have individual accomplishments and we'll continue to make progress. But I think it's, you know, it is unrealistic to think that when we start as far behind and have as many impediments that have been put in our place, that systems change isn't also necessary. So I guess I just go back and forth between saying we've got to do all we can for individuals, we've got to do all we can to make sure that people are using their money wisely, thinking about money wisely, but we've also got to think about what are the things that will really move us towards a more equitable society where those who you know, were intentionally left behind and intentionally had obstacles put in their place, that we remove some of those barriers so that everybody really does have the ability to reach their potential.
Very well said. Thank you, Dr. Gayle. Our next question that's come through the Q&A, and anyone can answer this one. This is a pretty good one too. We've been encouraged to think that our company's 401k plans help us to accumulate wealth. That said, this person says he currently contributes beyond his company's match. Should you actually use that surplus contribution to invest in the stock market instead of putting it in your company's 401k? Anyone's thoughts on that?
I would just offer quickly. I mean, I think some of it depends on the level of sort of sophistication of the investor. So I would say, to the extent you've got the company match, I'm always a fan of maxing that out. To the extent that the company has good investment options, and sometimes built in those options, they will also allow for some advice. Take advantage of that. Once you begin to move beyond that, again, whether it's through an investment club or some place where there's some kind of support for the investment that you're doing, I think that I would be comfortable saying that's something for people to pursue. If you're just doing it on your own, I mean, it is incredibly difficult. I mean, I've spent my career in investments, right? The proverbial beat the market by the individual doesn't generally exist. And so again, whether it's direct or indirect, I just think it's really important that people are advised when they do that.
I absolutely agree with Mr. Thomas. Great advice.
Thank you for that. And so we're going to get ready to close this out, being respectful of your time, before I hand it over to my sister, Kim Nute-Jones, who will close us out at the end. With our very last question, I wanted to ask, what are some of the things that we can do with regards to closing the wealth gap? What are some of the resources that might be available to close the racial wealth gap? How do we begin to close it? And as an advocacy group, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Chicago Metropolitan Chapter, how do we advocate to help change and make a dent in this racial wealth gap?
I want to start out because I think some of the other responders will have much more depth, but I want to say that what you're doing here is a good start. But I think the three-legged stool that's been referred to that Mr. Thomas mentioned earlier is something that gives us three specific paths to start addressing closing the wealth gap. And if we start to look at both the individual, the systemic, and the three levels together, then we can begin to plan strategically to make some progress toward closing that. Thank you for letting me be a part of this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Andre, for being a part of this conversation. And Mr. Thomas has typed into the chat some resources that he mentioned in his section of the discussion with regards to those books and his encouragement, which I wholeheartedly support, to read. And The Color of Law is an excellent resource. Dr. Helene would like to say goodbye. Dr. Helene, we thank you so much for your presence in this conversation, your thought leadership, your expertise, and your guidance. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Any last thoughts from any of our panelists before we close out this conversation? Again, on behalf of our president, Dreama Lee Waldman, and the 143 women who are a part of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Chicago Metropolitan Chapter, we are indebted to the four of you. We thank you for your expertise, your graciousness, your insight, and this conversation today. So as we end this conversation, those of us that are NCBW members, we're going to stay and we're going to hang out a little bit and have a little bit of an after party, a Zoom after party after the discussion. So we welcome you to stay online with us as we just have a sisterly chat about this very important and timely conversation. And you know what, Shundrawn, you can stay too.
The only thing I was just gonna add, you asked if there are any last thoughts, and I was simply gonna say, I think that we should all think about everything that we have at our disposal that can make a difference. We work for organizations where we can think about who we hire. Are we hiring people from communities where there's high unemployment, where we have jobs that we know could start people on a career track that they might not have otherwise? Are we thinking about even who we use in our procurement? Are we hiring from minority firms? Are we using lawyers of color? Are we using communications firms of color? How are we using our spend in ways, I'm a foundation. We have made a really big push around Black and brown money managers to manage our endowment. Are we thinking about things like that? And are we looking at the advocacy and public policy arena to be smart about the things that are going through, bills that are going through that can make a difference for our community, broadly, but particularly when it comes to these issues around wealth and wealth accumulation. So anyway, it was great to be with everybody. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
So did we, and that was an excellent answer about being strategic, about how we procure, the resources we use, who we're hiring, and being very deliberate and intentional, because that will also make a significant or an impact into closing the gap or making some headway. So thank you for that. I'm so glad you graced us with staying a little bit longer. So thank you. Great last words.
Dora, can I offer, because Ian, I don't know at what point I'm going to get booted out of the sisterhood. So can I offer this?
I'm not going to boot you out. You're an honorary member. Honorary.
So, because you asked about last word, I thought it was worth offering this. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I remember back it was probably over a year ago, a really talented actress. She's a producer, Issa Rae, and they were asking her on one of the award shows, like, who is she rooting for? She said simply, I'm rooting for everybody Black.
Everybody Black.
Look, I'm rooting for everybody Black. I say that because of this. When I think about even the power of what you're doing here today, it reminds me of Frederick Douglass's quote. He said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Usually people stop there, but the rest of it is important. He says it never did and it never will. And then he said, find out what people will submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong, which you can actually impose upon them. And so again, it can be overwhelming for us to think about something as, sometimes almost mentally disabling, as what we see in terms of systemic racism and oppression and all the things that we go through. But there are also principles and laws in the system. And you know what? When you access them, it's like gravity. It works. If I jump up, no one can stop gravity from pulling me down. And if I'm invested in a fund that other people invested in, I get the same return that they get. And so whether it's when we leave this, going on our jobs and saying, what does it mean when I start where I am with what I have, right? And do everything that I can? What does it mean practically to be rooting for everybody Black? What am I doing to open that door of opportunity for somebody else? Or am I a manager, really extending myself and hiring people that look like me, pushing the firms that will actually write a check to deal with their guilt from a charity standpoint. And we give more as a percentage charity-wise than any other ethnic community. We don't need more charity, and I'm not knocking charity. We need more equity. And so pressing the companies that we work with to say, do business in and with the communities you say you care about and that we're a part of. Do business in and with alongside, communities of color, particularly Black entrepreneurs. I think that's, it's only part of the equation. It's not going to solve all of the public policy issues, but it will make a difference. So I really do encourage that. And when I think about the sisterhood and sisternomics and our connected communities, those are things that we can all press ourselves to do more.
Thank you for that. That is an amazing, that's an amazing response. And I think that's really spot on for a myriad of reasons. When we think about the concept of charity, charity is situational, and it's like happiness. It's fleeting. It depends on the situation and the moment in time. Whereas joy, of course, transcends situations. Equity transcends situations. So what we really have to do is press toward infrastructures, policies, procedures, just our day-to-day BAU that moves us toward equity instead of one-time charity that doesn't last and doesn't create these opportunities to really build wealth. So thank you for that. That was an excellent response. I appreciate that. And again, we are not kicking you out. You can stay as we move to the after party after the discussion. So again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on the ABCs of money, closing the racial wealth gap, presented by the Economic Empowerment Committee of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Chicago Metropolitan Chapter. Thank you and have an amazing day.